This is part 2 of Sókè, #EndSARS youth protests in Nigeria. So I'm going to talk now about democracy, youth protest, and activism. The definition of youth is not homogeneous. The United Nations, for example, categorizes people from 15 to 24 as youth, while the African Union categorizes people from 15 to 35 as youth. However, Nigeria currently categorizes people from 15 to 29 years as youth. This constitutes a change from the previous categorization that was in line with AU parameters, with the justification that the country does not want people who are, quote, masquerading, unquote, as young people to take advantage of benefits reserved for youth. In the National Youth Policy, Nigeria makes laudable commitments to its youth that, if taken seriously, should make the youth agitated and discontented, because all those commitments are yet to be met in a comprehensive and thoroughgoing way. There's a wide gap between the aspirations of the government in the policy and the lived experiences of the youth. So, the essence of having the youth policy is that the government says that it wants to contribute to meeting the needs and aspirations of the youth. It also wants to help to seek solutions to their problems, and it wants to enhance the capacity of all stakeholders that have an interest in youth advancement and empowerment to help the youth to realize their full potential. So in view of that, and the fact that this is a policy of the government, the experiences of the youth when it concerns the special anti-crime unit called SARS, it's in great disparity to the aspirations expressed in the youth policy, because the SARS units were targeting youth. They were acting in extrajudicial ways to inflict physical and also psychological harm on Nigerian young people for things that were as flimsy as they were dressed in a particular way, which made the SARS unit profile them as deviants, or they were carrying devices like smartphones and also computers. The SARS unit also extorted money from the people that they arrested, and they were very high-handed in the ways in which they responded to the youth in general. So the EndSARS youth protesters were decrying the violence of the SARS units. They were also complaining about the pervasiveness of impunity and lack of commitment to fundamental principles of democracy. They were calling for good governance, and this connects with mainstream liberal global perspectives that characterize third wave democracies, of which Nigeria is part. What they were doing in their protest was a rejection of the perpetually unmet aspirations that they experience as citizens of Nigeria. Now, liberal perspectives on good governance associate good governance with respect for democratic principles, including, quote, according to the World Bank, good civil rights with transparency, with the rule of law, and with efficient public services. Citizens under this kind of situation should have unimpeded voice in governing. They should have just, fair, and equitable treatment. The UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, also emphasizes citizens' participation, government's commitment to transparency and accountability, effectiveness, equity, the rule of law, the development of social consensus on, quote, political, social, and economic priorities. The UNDP also goes on to say that the participation of all citizens, including the poor and most vulnerable, in decision-making over the allocation of development resources is key to good governance. Now, the Ibrahim Index of Governance in Africa defines governance as the provision of political, social, and economic public goods and services that every citizen has the right to expect from their government. And it also says that a government has the responsibility to deliver to its citizens the social and economic public goods. Nigeria has declined from 25th in the continent to 34th of all the 54 countries in Africa. This was in 2019. In this year, 2019, it scored 46.6 in overall governance. In the same year, for civil liberties, Nigeria scored 49.9, and this was a decline from a score of 55.7 in 2010. For socio-economic inequality mitigation, Nigeria consistently scored 48.3 from 2010 to 2019. These statistics show that Nigerian youth have a reason to be discontented. Although this index gives a few statistics that show that Nigeria is moving in a positive direction. For example, public perception of the rule of law increased from 43.5 in 2010 to 50.9 in 2019. And public perception of anti-corruption increased from 30.4 in 2019 to 68.7, 30.4 in 2010 to 68.7 in 2019. However, the low overall governance scores indicate that Nigeria is not doing well on many indicators. And this is a factor that contributes to youth restiveness. So one of the things about Nigeria is that this country has an abundance of natural resources. It has also an abundance of human resources. Nigeria ranks 161st out of 180 countries on the Human Development Index. And in quotes, a summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development, a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and have a decent standard of living. The These are the things that the Human Development Index measures. So the Human Development Index is the geometric mean of normalized indices for each of the 3 dimensions. And those dimensions are long and healthy life, second, being knowledgeable, and third, having a decent standard of living. Nigeria showed an awareness of our low metrics in socioeconomic and political indicators, and it has aspirations to create solutions, as evident in the following statement, quote, "The Economic Recovery and Growth Plan is a medium-term plan for 2017 to 2020, developed by the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari for the purpose of restoring economic growth while leveraging the ingenuity and resilience of the Nigerian people, the nation's most priceless assets," end quote. However, aspirations are insufficient. Historically, many laudable policies are made in Nigeria, and few are efficiently and effectively implemented, which is why the various indexes rank Nigeria low. The Economic Recovery and Growth Program has a target growth rate of 7% by 2020. And this was, significant because in the first quarter of 2016, the growth rate was minus 7.41%. The government also had plans of reducing the inflation rate from 18.6% in 2016 to single digits by 2020. This has not only not been achieved, the inflation rate is climbing precipitously as we speak in 2021 November. For the plugged-in youth who are aware of continental and global trends, the implication of these and other low socioeconomic indicators include the attractiveness of JAPA, or international migration strategies, their experience of economic uncertainties, lack of upward mobility, unemployment, underemployment, and lack of access to social services that are more readily available in the most desired migration destinations make the youth even more impatient with the inadequacies and privations in Nigeria. When these frustrations are combined with the impunity and violence experienced from the SARS security forces, despite years of protests, the 2020 protests were using Sókè strategies to loudly proclaim that enough is enough. Key global institutions in the liberal world order have been influential in shaping our understandings of good governance, pushing more radical perspectives that demand full equality in economic as well as social and political systems into the sidelines. According to the World Bank, whose vision pervades the liberal ideological arena, the dimensions of good governance include, quote, competitive private sector, structure of government, civil society participation and voice, and political accountability, end quote. Structure of government is about the strength, effectiveness, and efficacy of state institutions. And political accountability is about the expectation that those elected to represent the people are answerable to them, and that they will take responsibility when the state fails to meet its obligations to citizens. The World Bank also produces the worldwide governance indicators, for which, quote, governance consists of the traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. This includes the process by which governments are selected, monitored, and replaced, the capacity of the governments to effectively formulate and implement sound policies, and the respect of citizens and the state for the institutions that govern economic and social interactions among them. According to the worldwide governance indicators, there are 6 dimensions of governance. 1, voice and accountability. 2, political stability and lack of violence. 3, government effectiveness. 4, regulatory quality. And 5, rule of law. And 6, control of corruption. The demands of the EndSARS protesters reflects that they were asking for all of the above. As I said elsewhere in my Womanifesto 2022 keynote on October 24, 2022, we should expand our definition of corruption to include the normal understandings of what it entails concerning elections rigging, doing stomach infrastructure, intimidation, the use of violence, and otherwise subverting the process. But also we should include the persistence of bias and discrimination against women in Nigerian politics. This brings into perspective the ways in which social norms still intrude into struggles for a better Nigeria by the EndSARS protesters. Women participated robustly in all aspects of the protests, but there was still a male-dominant ethos and an expectation that the women would defer to the men and would take on the welfare and care work in addition to protesting. The way I see corruption, it goes beyond the conventional definition as, quote, abuse of public or entrusted power for private gain. Corruption is not a fixed set of practices, but rather an interpretive rubric that serves to make sense of and distinguish what is ethical or not, what is harmful or not, and what matters or not, and to whom in the ordinary processes of wealth accumulation and dispossession that define capitalism as we know it. Corruption is a capacious and slippery language put to a variety of opportunistic uses. Ironically, talk of corruption may be wielded by those who are most guilty of it. In some instances, corruption may also serve as a tool for progressive actors to critique capitalist forces. This is all according to the Antipode Editorial Collective's 2019 publication. The EndSARS protesters, when they called for accountability and transparency, they were also making a demand for an end to corruption in government. Transparency International ranks Nigeria 149th in 2020 and 154th in 2021 out of 180 countries in the Corruption's Perception Index. While there was a clear critique of corruption and bad governance in the EndSARS protests, it is doubtful whether there is significant critique of capitalism by the protesters. Most of them are plugged into not just the ideological mainstream of the liberal world system's political priorities, they are also neoliberal in their sensibilities, in their perspectives, and in their priorities. Hustling with the aspiration of prospering, wanting to blow, and God blessing one's hustle is part of the mantra of most Nigerians, and the youths are no exception. Of course, they're courageous in challenging the status quo, but what they're calling for is not a dismantling of the political and economic structures, but reforms that make the structures function well, and where social privileges and hierarchies are tinkered with, but not fundamentally transformed. However, thinking about the horizontal mode of organization observed in the EndSARS movement and the refusal to enter into the political system in any visible way as representatives of the movement in the formal political processes, including the commissions of inquiry established by various levels of the Nigerian government, it seems likely that the youths were reluctant to become integrated into a system that they critique as corrupt and undemocratic. For their stance to be effective, the EndSARS protesters must present alternatives and also work on building structures that actualize and institutionalize such alternatives. This requires long-term efforts, focused attentiveness, and tenacity. So it remains to be seen whether these things are going to be done in a way that enables the protesters to move beyond protest into institutionalizing alternatives that show us their vision of the Nigeria they want to see. Scholars have observed various variations between mature and emerging democracies, noting that, quote, third wave democracies have three elements in common. The dominant role of youth is one, the absence of political parties as the main organizers is two, and the widespread use of social media as means of political action is three. It is notable that the youth in third wave democracies are both disengaged from conventional politics, and yet they play a significant role in politics broadly defined. This is obvious in contemporary cases like the Arab Spring. In like manner, Sókè or Speak Up, the youth protest that erupted in Nigeria in 2020 October were remarkable, impressive, and impactful. They've been studied and categorized as unique departures from previous generations' nudákẹ or keep quiet approaches to socio-political problems that articulated grievances and called for change. However, I find such conclusions to be ahistorical because Nigeria has many examples of youth protests in its history, and these could be seen as influencing contemporary challenges to the state. There were Occupy Nigeria protests in 2013. They were stimulated by discontentment with the government's ineffectual responses, to protest against the suspension of petrol subsidies in 2012. Other protests in the last 3 decades of the 20th century include the June 12 protest that began in 1993, the protests against the imposition of the neoliberal structural adjustment program in 1989, and the Ali Must Go protests against, among other things, the increase in the cost of meals in the universities in Nigeria in 1978. Seen within the general context of the few protests enumerated above, which had significant youth participation and leadership, and the record of protests during Nigeria's colonial history and in the post-colonial era, dubbing the older generation as nudákẹ is somewhat arrogant and ahistorical because it fails to articulate the powerful resistance against state impunity in Nigerian history. The #EndSARS protests are in keeping with a long tradition, not a departure from it. What is different is the context in terms of media, culture, globalization, and transnationalism. This was a national resistance because it was mobilized throughout Nigeria. It was urban, gendered, generational, as well as stratified by class and social status. It privileged the voices of the youth in Nigeria's metropolises and cities, places like Abuja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt, and those of more educated, more affluent, more technologically adept, media-savvy youths. It was a movement that included numerous middle-class and affluent protesters who are more cosmopolitan, more confident of their place in the world, more and somewhat more insulated than their poorer contemporaries who are more economically and politically marginalized and who lack the material and technological resources of the #EndSARS protesters. When they joined the protests, there was more display of pent-up anger, that is, the more politically and economically marginalized. And there was eruption of violent outbursts that included looting and emptying government storage facilities that stored COVID-19 relief food and other materials. The food was supposed to have been distributed to alleviate some of the suffering by people who, under lockdown, were having problems meeting their basic needs. However, at the time, they were being hoarded, and there was evidence that they were being misappropriated. This sparked anger and the expedient use of the conditions during the EndSARS protests to empty the warehouses. Private businesses were also affected. There was destruction of government property. The situation, of course, was more serious in Lagos, Oyo, Cross River, Osun, Delta, Kwara, Ogun, Kaduna, and Plateau states, as well as Abuja in the Federal Capital Territory, where there were crackdowns by security forces and curfews imposed. The uniqueness of the Sókè protests can be attributed to the simultaneous use of hybrid space and media to protest and disseminate information. This simultaneous use of physical as well as cyberspace enables the generation to formulate and strengthen and put in motion transnational communities in a manner that defies the constraints of spatial, temporal, and other boundaries. Using the tools and mechanisms available, Nigerian youth engaged in constitutive acts that shape political, economic, and social relations in ways that could only be imagined before the availability of the cutting-edge communication tools accessible during the contemporary age of globalization. I date that age from roughly the end of the Second World War until the present. Using the hashtag #EndSARS protests as an entry point, this chapter will focus on how the simultaneous use of hybrid spaces shapes, limits, extends, and otherwise affects the possibilities of democracy, citizenship, and identity. The Sókè protesters in the hashtag #EndSARS protests used both physical and cyberspace to communicate with the state and public. Cyberspace enabled the protesters to transcend the limits of physicality, communicating in real time with transnational communities of African and Nigerian diasporas and beyond. The success of failure of youth protests show us the limits and infinite possibilities of many of our social, economic, and political constructs, institutions, and their dialectical relationships. Even when these hybrid protests fail to accomplish stated objectives, as with the #EndSARS protests, they enrich our understanding of transnationalism, globalism, democracy, citizenship, and identity, and will influence the future youth protests in Nigeria and the world at large. So we'll take a pause, and part 3 is coming.